So today we're going to be answering the question on how the hell were the Orangebox games ported to the Xbox 360? Well, it's a little thing called optimization. Optimization is where developers basically downgrade the graphics for the consoles to have less stress on their CPUs and to be able to run them better. And as an example, some games like GTA 5, and not just GTA 5 but other games too, they would make the render distance a lot lower, like in Minecraft, so that less of the map is being rendered at a time and they've got more RAM freed up, and they'll probably make less NPCs spawn so that they've also got more RAM freed up. So therefore, there's less stress on the CPU and there's less stress on the GPU. So by lowering the render distance, the GPU doesn't have to work as hard, and by lowering the amount of NPCs spawning, the CPU doesn't have to assign a model to them and stuff, and the GPU won't have to render those models. But anyways, this is about the Orangebox. This is about how Half-Life 2, Portal 1 and Team Fortress 2 were ported to the Xbox 360. So when they were designing the Source Engine, they'd actually designed it to be more like modular, so that they could port it over to other devices in the future. So they had that cut ahead for them, so it was easier to be able to port the Source Engine to the Xbox 360. But they did have to make a couple of changes here and there for it to be able to run on the Xbox 360. And when they were converting the graphics, the PC version of the Source Engine was designed, well, the PC version of Half-Life was designed to run with DirectX 8 and 9 on Windows PCs, where the Xbox 360 uses its own DirectX based API. So they had to rewrite the shader code, they had to adjust the lighting and HDR rendering, and we had to adjust the way the textures were rendered, so for it to be friendly with the console's 512MB of RAM. And I kid you not, the Xbox 360 actually had 512MB of RAM. It was mind blowing when I found out about it too. I mean, you're telling me they got like probably a good amount of Xbox One games running on a console from 2006. Honestly, it just blows my mind how optimized some of those games were. I mean, cause sometimes, like in Burnout Paradise, you can't even tell how bad the textures look sometimes. I mean, at least I can't tell. But anyways, we're not talking about Burnout Paradise, we're talking about the Orangebox. And speaking of the console's 512MB of RAM, the PC version was designed for 1 to 4GB of RAM, because that's like how much RAM the PCs would have had at the time. But the Xbox 360 had 512MB of RAM, which is a quite drastic change from 1 to 2GB. So they had to compress most of the models for them to be able to be stored in RAM and not take up too much RAM. Because for example, if you're walking through certain areas, the game will load them gradually, because that's how the Source Engine is programmed. But because the Xbox 360 had such low RAM, they had to heavily compress those models so that they could be stored in RAM and quickly uncompressed and loaded into the map. And then those other models would immediately be unrendered to save on RAM. And the physics, oh boy. Physics interactions are some of the biggest memory hoggers. So most of the physics interactions, some of the less important physics interactions, were moved over to different CPU cores. But the more important physics interactions, like I don't know, say NPCs dying from Fabric Glory, those are moved on to some of the main CPU cores for them to be loaded faster. And they kind of like capped the object limit, so that if the engine tried to spawn too many objects, it would eventually reach that cap to stop it from spawning too many objects at once and filling up the console's RAM and then the console would crash. So that's another thing they did. Also, they'd already optimized the physics for the Source Engine on the original Xbox, because somehow they ported Half-Life 2 to the original Xbox about a year prior to the Orangebox on the Xbox 360. So they actually had that a bit easier for them. But if you want to hear more about that, I think Modern Vintage Gamer, he did an explanation on that, on how impossible that port was for Valve to make. But that's an entirely separate video, I'll probably link it down in the description. Also, some of the other things I'll be mentioning in this video, they will be from some of ratlobbers' videos too. And to end off this section of the video, we're going to start talking about NPCs. So, NPCs were kind of like the models. They were optimized so that they would render on different CPU cores, and their voice lines and dialogue and stuff, they would also be played so the player can hear them and stuff and know what's going on. So they already had the engine ported over, so it was pretty easy to basically port over Portal over to the Xbox 360 since Portal is built off of Half-Life 2. And Jesus Christ, I'm going to say Portal a lot, so from now on I'm going to refer to it as P. Now P, most of the core functions were basically nailed down because they'd already done it with Half-Life 2. The only problem is portals. The portals themselves were the hardest part, because the portals in P, they kind of act like a live window into another part of the level, essentially just using render target. But the thing is, trying to get all of that to work on 512 megabytes of RAM, it's very, very hard. So what Valve did was they lowered the resolution on the inside of the portals. So when you see that live when you see that live window into another part of the level, that was a way lower resolution than the rest of the level, so I won't have to render as much. And because the portals took up so much RAM, they had to simplify some of the model's geometry, like on the weapons and stuff. They also had to have more of the textures streaming from disk rather than putting them in RAM. And another thing that helped Valve save memory was by keeping the maps enclosed, so that none of the sky was rendered. And those little watch rooms, the models in those little watch rooms were very simplified, because they'd get blurred out anyway and you wouldn't notice how triangle-y they are. And unfortunately, that's basically it for Portal. Moving on to TF2. Now, just a quick warning to TF2 fans, this chapter of the video will be a bit shorter than the rest of them, because I've already covered most of the stuff about the engine in the other chapters. Anyways, onto TF2. One of the ways Valve optimized TF2 on the Xbox 360 was by removing cosmetics. And if they had cosmetics, first of all, the game wouldn't fit on the disc, since discs back then were only a certain size and Blu-ray didn't exist back then, so yeah, they wouldn't have been able to fit every single cosmetic model on the entirety of the Xbox 360 discs. And they knew they were going to add new cosmetics in the future, and they didn't want Xbox 360 players to miss out on those new cosmetics and be stuck with the old cosmetics. And plus, the Xbox 360 rendering all those cosmetics on different players would run out of RAM very, very quickly, and you can't exactly just stream cosmetics and models and stuff off the disc. It really only works with text and sound. And because of Microsoft's greediness, Microsoft pushed Valve to move the TF2 servers onto Xbox Live, so that if players didn't have Xbox Live, they won't be able to play TF2 online. Which, honestly, sounds pretty stupid. Imagine buying the orangebox and then realizing you can't play TF2 just because you can't afford Xbox Live. But yeah, that would have infuriated a lot of people at the time. And because TF2 is an online game with loads of people dying every 5 seconds, they had to lower the character LODs. And if you don't know what LODs mean, neither do I. Although it means detail. They had to lower the character model detail. So basically, downgrade the character models so that when players are running around, the Xbox 360 doesn't have as much stress on its GPU. Also, some particle effects were removed and some particle effects were simplified. So like, say, the particle effects of Spy or something, those were simplified so that the Xbox 360 wouldn't have to render as much. Also, sadly, because of the limitations of pushing updates up to games, Valve couldn't update TF2 on the Xbox 360, so it stayed as the original 2007 port. Unfortunately, which meant that the game sort of broke over time. Anyways, that about ends off this section. Thank you for watching, and one thing I want to say is that the PS3 version of the Orange Box wasn't developed by Valve. Gabe Newell said it was a waste of everybody's time. So Gabe Newell, he asked Electronic Arts, before they went rogue, to develop it for them. So then, ultimately, the PS3 version was developed by Anyways, yeah, thanks for watching, and the videos that I mentioned in this video will be linked in the description. Ratlobbers, not Metrobyte. Ratlobbers, the modern vintage gamer. Yeah, they'll all be linked in the description. Goodbye.